Hello there, fair podcast listener, and thank you for downloading this episode 10 of the Emotion at Work podcast. I was reading a piece this week that says most podcasts don't get past episode 7, so I guess I've achieved that goal. I hope you like what I do on this podcast. I work really hard to A, get some really interesting guests, and B, put some really useful and helpful kind of content out there. So if you do like what we do on this podcast, I'd be really grateful if you could leave me a review. If you could head over to iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts from and leave us a review to tell us what you think of the podcast, that would be amazing. I'd be really, really grateful. Those reviews help me make the podcast as good as it can be, but also it helps other people find us as well. So if you could do that, that would be great. I also wanted to share something as well. So we've had a previous guest on this podcast called Georgie Nightingale. She runs an organisation called Trigger Conversations, and they're about kind of changing up meeting new people so that you have more meaningful conversations more quickly. So she wants to really get rid of and get past that superficial stuff to have more meaningful conversations, to build real connections, and then she puts together extraordinary evenings. Now Trigger is turning 1 soon. It's turning 1 on the 16th of October. So she's having an event in London, and you can find details of that at triggerconversations.co.uk. So if that interests you, then and you're in and around London on the 16th of October, then I'd heartily recommend heading along to one of Georgie's events. The question that I ask our guest this week is taken from the menu of questions that Georgie puts together at one of her Trigger evenings. So a worthwhile place to go. So let's get back to the podcast then. Episode 10. Somebody that I have wanted to get on from the start of putting this podcast together. She's a co-author of one of my favourite books. And yeah, I get quite excited in this one. So sit back, relax, here we go. And it is, believe it or not, episode 10. Hello, welcome to the Emotion at Work podcast, where we take a deep dive into the human condition. And today's episode is looking at about emotion at work in everyday talk. So on this podcast already, we've had a couple of different guests talking about talk, if I can use the word talk as many times in one sentence. So we've had a forensic linguist talking about the intersection of language and law, and we also got into talking about formulaic language. We also had another guest that came on to talk about some of the rituals that we have in conversation, and the conversation can be quite ritualized, and her work in kind of changing that up. And this podcast is going to continue to look at language, but more specifically looking at spoken language and what it can tell you about identity. Our guest today is a researcher and a lecturer at Loughborough University, and is the author of one of the most thumbed books in my bookcase. So one of the other podcasts I listen to is by a guy called Tim Ferriss, and one of the questions he asks his guests a lot is, what book have you gifted the most? And the book I've gifted the most is the book of our podcast guest today. So I know that she's got a really busy. She had a really busy summer. Teaching is going to start soon, and so I'm very grateful to have her with us today. So I'd like to welcome this week's guest to our podcast, which is Dr. Jessica Robles. Hi, Jessica.
Hi.
How you doing?
I'm all right, thank you.
Good. So normally on a podcast like this, we get the guests to tell us a bit more about kind of themselves, and that will come out as we work our way through the conversation. But one of our previous guests, who I mentioned earlier on, talked about the rituals in conversation. So rather than do the standard opening, I thought I'd go for a different question, if that's okay with you.
All right.
Fab. So the question that came to mind for our discussion today is, what makes a great travelling companion?
Oh, wow, that is a good question. Let's see. I think it depends on the person. So if I were to answer for myself, it has to be somebody who has a sense of humor about things and doesn't get too upset when things don't go their way.
Okay. So you're thinking like travel plans within that, or just generally?
Just general approach to life. So even if you shrink it down to a single thing that you do somewhere you've traveled, like let's say you go out to dinner, right? You don't get exactly the right table you want. The service is not quite as fast as you want. The food doesn't look exactly right. It has to be, the person I'm with has to be somebody who can roll with that and still have a good time without every little upset sort of ruining the experience.
Okay. I like that. See, for me, it's someone who is happy to just do nothing.
Yeah.
Because I don't know. I find that I do lots of things in my life, but traveling is one of those where I just like to sort of sit and soak up or drink in, depending on the metaphor you want to use, the surroundings that I'm in. So and it's something I think also. I don't know if it's just to do with having kids, but I don't get to do it as much when I travel now. So one of my favourite things I ever did was when I went to Rome with my wife. And we just sat in Piazza Navona for about 5 hours, and we just sat and people watched, and we didn't really talk to each other that much. Actually, we just kind of sat and drank. Well, she drank coffee, I drank beer, but it was just great just to sort of just be there and just enjoy all the surroundings and everything that went with it. So that would be something that's important to me. That it's okay just to sit and be with the surroundings that you're in.
Yeah, that's actually why I like to travel alone a lot.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay. And is traveling something you do? Is that a big thing? Is that a sort of a part of what you do?
It's a huge part of my work, and it's probably one of the most important priorities of my life. It's the main thing I spend money on, and then I sometimes don't have money to eat properly in the week, but I will travel, by God.
Wow. And what's been your I don't know if the word favourite's the right word, actually, but I can't think of it. So what's the favourite place you've been to, say, in the last year or two?
Oh, goodness. Well, I don't know if it's favourite, but a recent place that I've been to that I had not spent much time in before was Hawaii. And
okay.
It was, in summer, and so I properly took time off, and I didn't do any work, which is unusual for me. So usually I work through my vacations as well. So it was really nice.
And you've given me the link now, so I'll link back into work then. And do you find yourself, as a researcher and someone who's interested in kind of language and identity, do you find yourself sort of catching what's happening and how people are interacting with each other while you're away as well?
Constantly, yes. It's not the case that I do that because of the research I do. I think it's that I do the research that I do because I had that tendency already.
Oh, okay. So that was one of the things I was interested in. So have you always been kind of? When did the fascination for your area of kind of speciality start?
Yeah, it's been with me for a long time. So one thing that I remember is when I was young, if I did something wrong, sometimes I would try to work out why I'd done it wrong, and I'd realize it would be because I had interacted in sort of the incorrect way, either for some politeness rule or because of age differences. And as I got older, I became fascinated with language. I always loved reading, and I would develop these incorrect kind of theories about words and how they'd evolved. And of course, I had no idea what I was talking about or thinking about, but I was just fascinated with language and language development and language variation, and that's how I ended up getting into looking at things like communication and linguistics.
Wow. Because one of the things that always fascinated me, and I don't know when, as in I can't put an age on it, but I know I was young enough to realise the severity of trouble I was in. So the minute I got called Philip John, which is John's my middle name, then that was what I would now know as a pragmatic marker of you are in trouble. But I remember modulating my responses depending on the way I'd been summoned, if that makes sense. So I knew if I had how much leeway I had, or the amount of urgency I would need to give to attending to or being present where I was asked to be present, depending on the way I was summoned.
Yes. Yeah, I like to tell people that part of what fascinates me about interaction is I don't feel like I'm naturally good at it. So I felt like throughout my life I've had to pay more attention to it than maybe other people. And that's, in the end, I think made me a better interactor, but has also made me wonder, how is it that people know how to do this thing? Why does it seem so natural, but actually there are all these things you have to learn?
and the experiences that you need to go through to get there. So like you were talking about just now, in terms of the times you would get yourself in trouble, or you'd commit a faux pas or
exactly.
some description.
Yes.
Yeah.
I have a lot of examples of that.
And then, so I guess we talked about that. So there are a few terms in there that we both introduced that maybe we should go back and explore a bit more. So, so you earlier on you talked about for politeness reasons, and I think for most people, politeness would be, kind of saying please and thank you. But I think there's a bit more to it than that as well.
Absolutely, yes. So there are a lot of things, both in the way that you phrase how you speak, and also the little words that people usually think of when they think of politeness, like please and thank you. But it's a lot more than that. You can see that language is often kind of marked or more complex when people are being polite, especially in English. So rather than saying pass the salt, you would say something like, would you be so kind as to pass the salt? I mean, I don't know how many people would actually say that, right? But that's an example of the kind of distinction. And then there's also has to do with tone of voice, and sometimes adding things like sir or ma'am to what you're saying. So it's much more complicated than just remembering certain words. And in fact, you can use words that sound polite, but actually do it very impolitely. So if you say it sarcastically, for instance, and say thanks, right, you're not really being polite. So it's oversimplistic to say that it's just add this word and suddenly you're polite.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And I guess that's so one of the things that I can't remember if I've said this on the podcast before or not, but one of the things that my wife says to me a lot is, "Are you putting the kettle on?"
That's a great one.
Oh, would you like a cup of tea then, darling? With the emphasis and the elongated darling at the end.
Yes. Yeah, that's a great one.
Yeah. And so, and those things that people might do then, in terms to either to be polite or impolite, what could be some of the reasons for doing that? So you mentioned, again, when you were talking earlier on, you mentioned about age differences. Could that be one of the reasons why people might do something like that? If they're speaking to someone who's older than them, or...
Oh, yeah. Different ages. Generally, status in society is something that we mark by doing politeness. And so it could be that age is a part of that. It could be your position in social situations, or it could be in your workplace, the person who's the boss and so forth.
So somebody might use more politeness strategies with somebody who is superior or senior, maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe senior is a better word than superior.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. And does that, because one of the things that, again, we've touched on briefly on this podcast before is a notion of face.
Yes.
So does that link in with some of the aspects of face as well, would you say?
Yeah, well, the use of this idea of face is actually really, really helpful. So it comes from Erving Goffman, you might have talked about on your previous one. And so he described that there's this mechanism where we're sort of attentive to how the other person appears to the world, or how they appear to society and social situations. And so when somebody, say, does something wrong, like they make some sort of gaffe, then we try to save their face. If we're interacting with other people, we're trying to maintain our own face, a sort of impression that we want others to get of us. And so politeness works both ways with that, because it both kind of shows a respect for the face of the other, but also presents ourselves as respectable people and respectful people.
So because we do those politeness things,
exactly,
it then communicates that we are respectful, and
attentive and thoughtful, and all these good things. Yeah.
Okay. So is face something we do consciously then? Is that like a...
Well, whether it's conscious or unconscious, who can really know? We can't quite see inside people's minds to confirm that, but it's certainly something that people aren't necessarily aware of. Although if you point it out to people, they would probably say, oh yeah, of course I do that, right? They'll give some explanation. But oftentimes when people first learn about the concept of face, they think it's not something they do all the time. They think it must be something that they only turn on when they're not comfortable or when they're with strangers or something. But actually face is something that is with us all the time. It's not something that is necessarily overt and deliberate, but it's still something that could be kind of always underlying our interactions with others. Even when we're very comfortable and casual and just hanging out with our friends, we still care how we appear to them, and that's what face is about.
Okay. And because and earlier on I talked about, or in my introduction I think I talked about the work that you do with identity. Mm-hmm. So are face and identity, are they like almost synonymous with each other? Are they the same thing, or are they slightly different?
I think this is an ongoing conversation actually, but they're very, very similar, and they're sort of like just different ways of looking at something. So identity is a term that we usually use in a slightly different way to talk about sort of characteristics of a person or how they enact themselves in a variety of ways, whereas face is a little bit more focused on the relational dimension between people.
Okay, so identity almost encompasses something a bit broader, whereas face is often more concerned with the interaction that's happening there and then, or is it?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. Okay,
because I was wondering if so I get quite. So I'm taking our conversation to a space I wasn't going to take it, but there you go. We'll just run with that.
Yeah,
because I get interested in how the interlink between face and time. Mm. So even though I might be having an interaction with, so let's use the example I used early on. So my wife says to me, "Are you putting the kettle on?" Mm-hmm. And at that moment, I understand what she's trying to communicate to me is that she would like a hot beverage, mm-hmm. normally tea, but which variety of tea, whether it's breakfast tea or a herbal tea or something like that, I don't know. But also, that statement brings with it all of those statements that she's made in the past,
right.
and any associated meaning that I've brought with it. So the fact that I'd rather she would just say, "I like a cup of tea." But instead she continues. So even though I've said to her in the past, "Can you not just ask me if you want one? Just say I want a cup of tea, and I'll quite happily make you a cup of tea."
Right.
But she continues to kind of use that the indirectness or the politeness in it, because she doesn't want to stop me from. My interpretation is she doesn't want to stop me from whatever I'm doing. So I'm doing something else, even if that's just watching TV or reading. The fact that I've then got to stop what I'm doing and make the tea instead, she almost wants to reduce the impact that she's having on the inconvenience that she might add. Mm-hmm. Yet I still bring with me all of this stuff from the past, and it still makes me, it makes me grumpy. Not so, it doesn't make me angry, but I kind of walk into the kitchen going, "Oh, she just asked me for a cup of tea." Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. I think there's a really interesting dynamic between the things that happen in the moment of the situation and the sort of histories people have with each other. And that's one of the reasons that I initially got into looking at relationships primarily, and sort of the relational dimension of talk, is precisely because I would walk through grocery stores and see people interacting, and they might blow up at each other and get into an argument over what looked to me like nothing. But it's, of course, because there's a whole history there of previous interactions that they've had about those things, and trying to figure out and account for how you can explain that without all that history is sort of the problem of analysis in a way. So you're trying to deconstruct from a single interaction, what are all the things here that I can't see? And can I still make a convincing case for why they are involved in what's going on?
So it is, again, I'm biased because I'm in, one of the things I get fascinated by with is emotion. Mm-hmm. So is emotion almost, that's the wrong question. Different question. Is it common for emotion to be present when those relational aspects are happening? I know that's a loaded question.
Yeah. I think that's off. I mean, emotion is a resource, right? It's a thing that we can sort of present and perform for people in order to do something in the interaction. So when we want to be taken seriously, for example, we might raise our voice in certain ways that are associated with anger. If we want to be sort of have sympathy, right, we might allow our voices to tremble a bit more in ways that are associated with vulnerability and sadness. It's not the case that we're all doing this, in some hyper-conscious, intentional way, but these are resources that we've absorbed and learned how to deploy much more strategically than we realize.
So I just want to sort of nip back for a second in that you mentioned, when you said that emotions are a resource that we can you said something and perform, and it was the perform bit that got my attention.
Yeah.
So tell me a bit more about that.
So what's interesting about emotion is that people tend to see emotion as something that is sort of purely physiological, right? It starts in your body, you have no control over it when it sort of overtakes you and floods out of you, as Goffman would say. But oftentimes, emotion can be deployed in a way that actually has a function. And we see, for example, in people who are crying, they tend to stop crying at points where somebody else would interject. And you see this with very, very young children. So it's not something that people learn to do really late in life or after they've had hundreds of interactions. It's something that little kids will do. So they'll sort of do the crying, trying to get the attention, and as soon as they can tell that their parent is about to speak, the crying quiets down. It's something you can test out later, maybe with your own kids, if they're still in the crying phases.
Wow. Well, the youngest is 4, so
well, there you go.
we get faux crying. Well, we get the fake cry.
Well, a faux cry might just really be a cry that hasn't been learned to do very convincingly yet, as opposed to cries that happen, out of pure pain. But even that, it's still a surprisingly learned response compared to what we think it is.
I've never thought about it in that way. I've never thought about the. I've never thought about crying and the allowing space for the interjection. I've thought about it from lots of other ways, but I've not thought about it from a crying point of view, actually.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a fascinating thing, and in a way, it makes it even more interesting when you do see situations where people are sort of so crying so hard that they almost literally can't speak because it's sort of crossed over into something else at that point. But that's very, very rare. Most of our social lives are filled with a kind of crying that actually we have much more control over than we might realize.
So do you think and/or are you aware of any research that? So if I just stick with that for a moment, what I wonder is, and I suppose I'm bringing some personal experience into it. So if I'm crying and then I notice that somebody is attending to that in whatever way, so I got their attention, or they've stopped what they're doing, or whatever that is. I wonder if there's a sequence, a communicative sequence that leads up to me leaving the gap for them to speak.
Right. Yeah. So usually it's the same way as any kind of sequence in interaction, where you sort of design what you're saying, and then you can tell when it's a relevant moment for somebody to respond to you, and all sorts of things like crying, laughing, whatever, they're still part of that sequence.
Yeah. Yeah, because I get quite fascinated with things like turn taking, with how people share the floor with each other. I especially like news announcements. I really love news announcements. So I know I'm chucking a load of terminology out, which we'll come back to in a minute. But I've just never. You've really got me thinking, because I've never considered it from in the interaction around crying before. That's something for me to think about. So that systemicness then. So and again, I've just thrown a few terms out. So let's pick up on one. Let's go for news announcements, because I said I like them. So because I find the interaction between sort of surprise as an emotion and I'll leave that term broad for a moment. I'll come back to it. But the interaction between news announcements and surprise and faux surprise.
Yeah.
You know, because if I think about the work, say I'm a huge fan of Paul Ekman's work, and you know, his research has suggested that surprise is to do with something occurring that is sudden and unexpected. Now, if we then link that to the idea of news announcements, which, and you can correct me if I get this, please correct me if I get this wrong, is that in a lot of cases people will announce that they will pre-announce that they've got some news to share with things like, "Are you sitting down?" or I've got something on my mind," or
Yes.
"This strange thing happened to me today." You know, so you've got that kind of pre-announcement, which then, and if I link that then into when people then kind of go, "Oh," or "Really," or "Wow," or those sorts of things, I'm like, is that genuine surprise? Because that can't be sudden and unexpected anymore, because you knew something was coming. Now, I guess what it is may have still been unexpected,
Right?
But yeah, so I find that quite interesting. You know, is it faux surprises or not?
That's the great thing about a pre-announcement, actually, is because it basically tells the other person, you better react to this with surprise.
Yeah. You need to be surprised now.
Yeah, which is a really good way to ensure that the other person is going to basically give you some kind of response that you want. You can imagine, you know, somebody not doing any kind of preface or any indication. I don't know how this would happen. Maybe they're texting and just saying, "I'm pregnant," right? And then the other person is like, "Is this a good thing, a bad thing? Like, what's going on?" Because if you don't know the person very well, you might not know. And so saying, you know, "The greatest thing happened to me," or "You'll never guess," and using a certain tone of voice and so forth, it helps the other person out so that they can respond in the way that you were hoping, maybe, and get the conversation going in the direction you want, as opposed to stopping it short and going, "Oh, now it's awkward."
Yeah. Because you'll have those associated paralinguistic clues, won't you?
Exactly.
Those non-verbal bits that will tell you, you know, "Are you sitting down" delivered with a great big smile and a slightly excited tone, or is it delivered with a is it delivered with something different?
Right, exactly.
Yeah. So news announcements is one example. What other sort of examples might be? So, you know, a lot of my listeners are in their workplace. So what other kind of sequences might they spot in the interactions that they have, or some common ones, do you think?
Well, there's invitations to do various things. So if you want to ask somebody to do something, whether it's in the workplace or for a social engagement, usually that also will have some sort of pre-sequence involved with it. So you'll say, you know, "Are you free Friday?" or "Do you have some spare time later today?" And then you get some sort of request or invitation either to do something or to maybe go with you somewhere. And usually, again, that pre-sequence is a really nice way of getting that person to sort of be on board with a possible thing that's coming up. When somebody says, you know, "Are you free later today?" you know that they're about to make a claim on your time in some way.
Yeah.
So you can already start to sort of anticipate that, and then, you know, that helps you formulate a response.
And so is there almost some and again, this might not be on a conscious level, but there's some complicit face-saving stuff happening. Yeah,
face is definitely, I would say, I mean, according to Goffman anyway, face is sort of an explanation you can apply to all of these things, potentially.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I've got something that I want you to do that might take, I don't know, record it. Let's use. I almost want to use a real example. So I've got something that's going to take your time. Like I want to have an hour of your time to record a podcast. You know, so then I'll then use the pre-invitation. Did you call it a pre-invitation?
You could, it could be or pre-request.
Pre-request. That was it.
Yeah.
And then I'll judge on your response. You know, I'll use the way that you might immediately respond to that request to modulate how much of your time I might ask for.
Exactly.
So if your response is,
exactly.
Yeah. I've got some time. Okay, so I won't ask for an hour anymore. Right. I'm only going to ask for half an hour.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And Any others? So we've had pre-requests, news announcements. Any other common ones?
Oh, I mean, there's a gazillion. I guess this is maybe a slightly boring one in a way, but the most common one probably is just greetings. So anytime you open an interaction with anyone, whether it's a service encounter or a telephone call or seeing a friend, you usually have to do this interesting little exclamation of the fact that you're opening a conversation before you do anything else. And that has to sort of be reciprocated in some way, and then you can move forward. And this is something that I sometimes forget to do in certain situations. So I commonly will write an email and then stop before I send it and go back to the beginning and then add a greeting because I've forgotten to add that part. And that's doing a little bit of, I think, politeness work, recognizing that people expect to be greeted and not just treated like machines that you're going to give instructions to.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess those things will be modulated as well by the relationship that individuals have with each other. So depending on how well people do or don't know each other, there may be more or less of an inclination or a need to add some of those things in.
I think to some extent that's true, but I don't know that it always lines up in the way you'd expect. So I think a common thing is that we assume that people we're closer to will forgive us a lot, but actually sometimes the people we're closest to will demand the most. And so one of the things that I learned painfully over the years is with my partner, when he comes home, I have to stop what I'm doing and ask him how his day has gone. And that's something that I explicitly had to teach myself, because otherwise I would just keep working and maybe eventually say, are you hungry or something? Or I might give him a hug, but I would not sort of do that ritual of seeing how a person's day was, stopping what I'm doing, making sure I'm attending. There's a whole kind of ritual that you have to go through to reaffirm that, yes, you're focused on this relationship and that is more important than anything else that's going on. So I was not going to be let off the hook for that particular thing.
Because I find an example like that really interesting from the perspective of you've got one individual who would perceive the non-communication, if that's an alright label to give it, as something to be frustrated by or annoyed at, and then for another, then it's just okay because there's no negative meaning to it. It just is what it is.
Right.
Because we've talked a little bit earlier on about how talk or interaction can be a way to perform or to perform and or inform people about emotions that we're expected to do or we want them to do. And I then get interested in so does emotion shape talk, or does talk shape emotion? Or is it a bit of both?
I think it's definitely a bit of both. I think, as I was sort of indicating earlier, I think we tend to overemphasize the idea that emotion shapes talk, and I like to kind of look at how talk actually is shaping the emotion. But it's a reciprocal relationship. So yeah, they're working together really.
And I guess that can come down to specific language use as well. So if I think about if I think about a workplace interaction that I've had in the last couple of years, I was asked to do some thinking on a project or a challenge that the organisation had, and I came back with my thinking, and the response I got was, "Phil, we're not trying to boil the ocean here."
What does that mean?
So it means like when we're trying to. That would involve an awful lot of energy, so to boil the ocean would take, that's like a massive task.
Yeah, I've never heard that phrase before.
Okay, so as a metaphor, it really kind of knocked me for six.
Yeah.
And I felt myself getting both angry and so I was a mixture of angry, scared, and sad all together wrapped up into one. Yeah, because I was annoyed because both at the statement and at myself. So I was annoyed at the statement, to be like, you're disparaging my work. I was annoyed at myself because I'd got it wrong. Whether I know that's always down to subjective, but I'd got it wrong because I'd done the wrong thing. I was then scared because I'd done the wrong thing, and has that then kind of impacted my credibility or my reputation? And then also sad at the loss of time that I'd put in to do it, but also at the fact that I hadn't delivered on what the other person wanted for me. And I remember the person that made the statement was then really surprised at my response. They were like, well, no. I was just saying that you've just taken your thinking a little bit bigger than what I needed it to be. And I was like, no, that's a complete contrast. Just now you said bore the ocean, and now you're saying it's just a little bit, you're thinking a little bit broader than it needed to be.
Yeah.
And then I was like, well, what is it? Is it this or is it that?
Yeah. See, did you receive that over in writing, or was that a face-to-face conversation? It
was a face-to-face conversation.
So that is really interesting, because you would think that if somebody meant it sort of tongue-in-cheek, that would come across in the way that they'd said it.
Yeah, and it didn't. It really didn't.
Right. Well, I mean, that's sort of the puzzle of human interpretation, right? Is that you don't ever know exactly how somebody really intended something. I mean, communication is exactly something we have to do because we can't read each other's minds. So you'll never really know if they meant it that way or not, or if they merely backtracked and realized, ooh, maybe I came across too strong and need to modify this in some way.
Yeah, and yes, I agree. Because that feedback loop is, you can only work with so much of the information that's available. So what could have been meant in an innocuous way, and genuinely meant, with no malintent behind it.
Exactly.
I heard as a real strong kind of challenge to the effort, energy, work, and everything else that I'd put into it.
Right. Yeah.
And I'm sure I brought with me some historical stuff. I'm sure there were some occasions that I've had in the past where I've done similar pieces of work and it hadn't hit the right spot, for want of a better phrase. And I was recalling all of those aspects as well, I would imagine. I don't know for sure, but yeah.
Right. Yeah. I think that this really opens up two ways that can help with interaction, just when we're reflecting on our own interactions. Is one thing is, whenever you say something, to think through all the possible ways the other person could interpret it. So rather than just saying, oh, I intended this, therefore they're going to take it that way, from the perspective of another person, you can say, is this going to be taken the wrong way? Could this be taken the wrong way? Can I ensure that that's less likely and that they will hear what I meant to say? And from somebody else's perspective, right? So the person kind of hearing the statement on the other end, to think, what are all the interpretations that I could make of this? Rather than just the one that seems to strike me right off the bat. Because I think it's absolutely the case that when people misunderstand each other, it's often because they've jumped to the first kind of reaction they've had to a thing without thinking and stopping and thinking, maybe there are other ways that I could see this.
And you talked about misunderstandings in one of your recent papers, is that right?
Yes. So,
sorry, go on.
No, I was just going to say that's something that was related to what I was saying, is that we can also strategically misunderstand each other, or use misunderstanding not as something that is a simple, oh, I didn't literally understand, but that you can kind of act or present yourself as though you didn't understand somebody else.
Oh, tell me more about that.
So one thing that I've always been interested in is disagreement and conflict. And usually I look at very, very little kind of conflicts. And one of the things that misunderstanding can do in a conflict is it can treat what's going on not as a conflict, but rather as something where you have simply misunderstood what the other person's saying. And it's a way of sort of getting out of having to disagree about something. And so I think it's something that you can use if you're in an interaction that you don't want to go sour, or if you're in an interaction that you don't need to go off on this tangent, right, and get into an ideological argument about it. But you can kind of just sort of act as though, oh, it was a simple misunderstanding, we just use different words, or, I think we're talking about the same thing, but we really just don't hear each other. There's lots of different kind of things people can say that suggest that they don't really disagree, but that they simply don't understand each other. And sometimes that's what you need to do, because not all battles are worth fighting.
Yeah, true. and I guess you're when I say you're, I don't necessarily mean you in that, but
the generic you.
Yes, what those in the interaction there are doing is a reframe.
Yes.
And that could be from a few different perspectives. It could be from an emotion perspective. So I've had many conversations in my time where, you know, someone's come to me and said, "Oh, so and so sent me this email. Have a read of it. So and so said this to me. What do you think?" And as part of that, I guess the difference is this is out of the interaction. So this is, you know, post it happening. And then I'll do some of that reframing work to say, well, okay, so that's how you've heard it, or that's how you've received it. How else could what else could they mean when they say that?
Exactly.
You know, what could be another interpretation of that?
Yeah.
You know? So they asked you to do a piece of work, you did it, and then they said, I didn't want you to boil the ocean. What else could they have meant by that? You know,
Exactly.
What else what else could be happening? What else could be going on? And would they be classed as sort of from a discourse analysis or conversation analysis? I get confused which one it might be, because I know they're slightly different. Would that be a repair? Is that as using misunderstanding as a repair kind of mechanism?
I mean, repair can be on understanding. So you can repair things that aren't necessarily about sort of content misunderstanding. For example, if you just didn't hear somebody, but yes, one thing that you can repair is an understanding, or you can sort of purport to be repairing a misunderstanding when actually you might be kind of dodging an argument.
And what other sort of repairs are there then? So you said so you could repair understanding.
And hearing. So if somebody says something and you literally don't hear it, then you can sort of ask them to say it again. Or you can also repair sort of speaking. So when people restart what they're saying or reformulate what they're saying, or when you ask somebody else to sort of re-explain something because you didn't, quite understand it or something.
Okay. And a repair is like a linguistic term where there's been some form of misunderstanding or the communication hasn't been as clear as...
It's meant to sort of fix troubles in the progress of the sequence that you're trying to make happen. So, it's the kind of thing that you need to fix before you can move forward.
Okay. And I... So I'm really interested then in the strategic the strategic use of misunderstanding, because you're by saying it, you're implying that you need to fix something,
right?
You need to do a repair,
but
your reasons for doing so are different to the action of doing it. So you're doing a repair because you want to get out of that conversation, or you don't want to. It's not somewhere you want to go, or it's not a battle worth fighting. You're repairing, but for more strategic reasons than transactional reasons.
Yeah, I guess you could look at it that way. One of the examples that I have in the paper is where some friends are having dinner, and one of them is relating a conversation. Am I allowed to swear on this program?
You are, yes.
Okay. So one of the people in the interaction is claiming that she overheard two people interacting, and that one of them said "fuck me" to the other person, and she presents it as though it was a request for sex, and these two people are married to other people, not to each other. So it's supposed to be a funny thing, but it's a little bit taboo and dicey in the context of that conversation. And so the other person in the interaction, who's one of these people she's claiming had this interaction, says, no, I said fuck me. So she reframes it and repairs it into something that is more like an expression of dismay, because she'd found that they were out of line. And so all of the people in the interaction collaborate to basically make it as a mishearing or sort of a misunderstanding on the basis of having misheard these two words, rather than say, a disagreement about things like people's relationships, or having to get into whether these people are attracted to each other or not, right? So they avoid having to sort of deal with what could be a difficult, awkward conversation by just saying, oh, no, you misheard that.
Okay, that's a good example. Thank you. Yeah, because I can. So one of the things that I talk about is the use of strategic ambiguity.
Yes.
So part of the work I do is, yes, it's in emotion, but it's also into deception as well.
Yeah.
And for me, there's a big spectrum of of deception. So in that example that you've just given, I'm like, has everybody just complied with? Has there just been like a complicit reframing of the truth to something that is just more socially acceptable?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think that's most of social life, to be honest. Well,
so yes, I think as almost look at me, look at putting lots of linguistic markers in. See, on a podcast with a linguist, the meta analysis of language is just insane.
Yeah.
Because deception oils the wheels, So it just does. Even right at the start of this podcast, we talked. You talked about greetings earlier on, off air. Mm-hmm. I mentioned to you how I'm, struggling with some health issues at the minute. But yet, when you asked me how I was at this, I asked you how you were at the start of the podcast. You said you were okay, and you said how are you, and I said I'm okay. And actually, I am, but I'm not. So
right. That's a famous work by Harvey Saks called "Everyone Has to Lie." It's like a section of his lectures, and basically it's exactly about the "how are you" question and how you have to say a certain thing in social situations, no matter what the actual facts of the matter are.
Yeah, and they work, and they have that social lubricant kind of ness to them because they allow people to interact and transact smoothly.
Yeah,
but they're not it's not necessarily always true. And I'm guessing. Sorry, go on.
Oh, I was just going to say that, Sachs makes that exact point that in a close relationship where the context of the conversation is we're here to have a serious conversation, you would absolutely never get let off the hook for saying, I'm fine. Especially if it was clear you weren't. Yeah.
And I think about some of the more maybe formal conversations that might happen in the workplace around things like, sort of whether they're called different things in different kind of contexts, I suppose. You might have like formal one-to-one discussions with, your manager or members of your team, or there might be, performance reviews or appraisals, or, where that exchange of how are you, I'm fine, thanks, how are you, I'm fine. If that was done in the office around the rest of the team, then it could work in that way. But then if you translate it, you change the context and put it into one of those other settings. So a one-to-one meeting with just the two of you in an office, or out walking around a lake or on a park bench or wherever it might be. Actually, that context then changes the. Yes. I don't know if the rules is the right word.
Yeah,
it just changes the
expectations. Yeah.
Yeah, because I get fascinated by the notion of allowable contributions. So where the context defines what you are and aren't allowed to say.
Yes.
And sometimes you have very formal ones, like in a courtroom or in a job interview. Those sorts of things. There are the general stuff. I think about a job interview as an example. In general, you are not allowed to ask questions of the organisation who are interviewing you until the end. You're not. So if mid-interview you were to ask a question of your interviewers, then that would most likely be a faux pas, unless there's been some explicit consent at the beginning to say if you've got any questions at any time, then just ask.
Exactly.
But generally speaking, you're not allowed to make that contribution until the interviewer or interviewers have exhausted all of their questions that they want to ask, and then you're allowed to do so.
Yeah, exactly.
And then if I think about map that out to other interactions, especially in groups or teams, say team meetings, or if it's a board meeting, those sorts of things. Like, I get really fascinated by who is and isn't allowed to contribute on what. So I was a fly on a wall once in an organisation where the HR director started talking about the financial performance of the organisation, and the finance director took a huge affront to that.
Oh.
You don't talk. You can't talk about the numbers. You don't know. You can't. You talk about the P&L and those sorts of things. Because in their kind of perspective on it, that was their contributions that the FD makes. The HRD can't talk about them or present them.
Yeah. Yeah, and a lot of that stuff is very implicit, even in more formal organizations, right? It's not like there's somewhere written in your job description, right? Yeah. You just sort of have to learn sometimes because somebody tells you, takes you aside, or you learn by doing it wrong and seeing how people react.
And have you ever committed any? Have you done any sort of faux pas that you look back on now and go, oh, how did I not know, or how did I misread that?
All the time. I mean, so there are two famous ones. I say famous in my own personal life. Famous for me. The first one is one that happened when I was very, very young, where I was in the backyard and my mother was speaking to a neighbor, and I saw that the neighbor's bra was visible through the back of her shirt, and I was like, oh, well, that's not somebody's not wanting to have their underwear visible, right? So I walked up to them and I tried to be polite because I knew about politeness and how you shouldn't interrupt adults, and I waited for a chance to speak, and then I said as politely as I possibly could, excuse me, but your bra's showing. And my mother got very angry at me, and she thought that was quite rude, and I was very upset, and I couldn't figure out what I'd done wrong. And I look back on that, and I think that's probably where my interest in sort of like everyday morality began, is what are these sort of rules that we have to follow in order to be seen as good people? How do we protect, the sanctity of other people's identities by treating them in the right way? And how is it that something that seems good to one person seems like an affront to another? So that's one very early gaffe I had, but you might forgive me because I was 4. The second one is I'd had a long conversation with somebody at a party over the course of probably almost an hour, and a big part of that conversation was about the fact that he couldn't eat sugar. About an hour later, we were cleaning up the party, so we were helping kind of put things away, and there was a whole plate of cupcakes left, and I held the plate out to offer him the cupcakes, and he made this expression of dismay and said, "You're mean." And of course, in that instance, I realized what had happened is that I had forgotten the content of that conversation in that moment and done something that I thought was kindly, but actually is kind of a cruel thing to do to somebody who can't eat sugar. And I still don't know how I could have responded in that conversation in a way to kind of save it, because either way, right, I was in a dilemma. If I admitted that I had forgotten, then I had actually forgotten like a whole section of a conversation that really you should remember. And yet, if I didn't admit that, then I'm still being a jerk. So it was a lose-lose.
Yeah, because either you say, well, actually, because the risk is then the implication. If you've forgotten that important thing about me as an individual, if you just forgotten the whole conversation,
right, exactly.
You didn't pay any attention to me at all for that whole hour that we were talking.
Yeah.
Or you're just a meanie.
Exactly. Yeah, I think about it all the time still.
Oh, so you remind one of the. So you reminded me of one of mine, which is also about holding out food. So there was someone I used to work with who said they were. See, look, I'm even framing it now. They said they were allergic to bananas. And I was like, really? I can't be allergic to bananas. What a load of rubbish that is. So one day I ate a banana and I put it in a plastic cup on my desk. And then 24 hours later, when that banana was particularly smelly, she came down and she sat at the desk behind me. And I asked her, so I turned around to face her, she still had her back to me. And I said, "Oh, Emma, just turn around a second." And she turned around and I shoved this cup with a 24-hour-old banana in it right under her nose.
Oh, no.
And I thought I was being... I knew I was being a bit mean, but I thought I was being like mean and a bit funny. And oh my goodness me, it was just... it took me at least 3 weeks to get to repair that.
Oh no!
Profuse apology.
Yeah.
Absolute, because I thought, I didn't think it was a thing. I just thought, she said she was allergic to bananas.
To me, this is actually the fundamental problem of communication, is that people are different, and we have such a hard time putting ourselves in other people's places that we can't quite believe how different people can be, even down to really tiny things. So I don't know, you probably know who David Mitchell is. He has a YouTube program called David Mitchell's Soapbox, where he just rants about random things. And on one of these, he's so funny.
That's fine. I now want to go find it.
No, you should. But one of the rants he goes on is how people have differences of preference. And he starts out saying, I understand that people have different preferences in taste. Like, I love bacon, you don't like bacon. Okay, whatever, people have different tastes. But then he talks about how there are certain kinds of tastes that he just cannot believe, and he thinks it's wrong. So on certain movies, if you don't agree with me, you're just wrong, right? Like, he won't permit it. And then he actually comes around to saying, actually, deep down, I feel this way about food as well. I don't feel that it's actually possible for anyone to dislike bacon. It can't be possible. And likewise, it's not possible for people to actually like rhubarb. You must be lying to me. And I think that he's really on to something there. There's a little bit of something in us that almost suspects people must be lying if they're not seeing the world in the same way we are. And I think that even though we're talking about something very, very tiny when we talk about, food or even something like allergies, it has implications for everything. I think it's basically the fundamental challenge of humanity is getting past that weird thing inside of us that can't quite believe that somebody can be different in a really serious way.
And I think if I think about that in the context of the workplace as well, I wonder if the workplace it's even harder too.
Yeah.
Because especially if you've got or is it especially? I don't know if it is especially. But I guess I'm thinking back to occasions where there are two people that have the same job title. So essentially their job is the same.
Yeah.
But they might go about it very differently. And the need for and I'm using others in a broad way because I've had experiences of both. So I've had experiences of many different. So it could be that a manager sees their two members of their team who have the same job doing it differently and therefore wants them both to do it the same. It could also be that if you've got person A and person B, person A does it in this way and person B does it differently. So they compete with each other to get the other one to conform to their way of doing whatever the job is.
Yeah.
But when you're, I guess what I'm saying is when you're in the workplace, you're often put into a box of the role that you do, and that then forms part of your identity.
Yes.
And then others will identify things with the box that you are in. So if you are a finance director, or if you are a road cleaner, if you're a bin emptier, if you're a security guard, whatever that role is that you've been given as part of your job, others will project expectations onto that.
Exactly.
And then if you act out of line with those expectations, even though what you're doing may be perfectly appropriate and achieve the same outcomes or goals, can be viewed as being dissent or inappropriate or whatever, or other labels that can go with it.
Right. Or can even make people around you feel insecure in some way or reflect negatively on their own way of doing things, especially if what they're doing is not as common or accepted. So maybe they're doing the job in just the right way for them, but because they see somebody else doing it in another way, they start to doubt themselves. And then that can maybe, lead to problems in their ability to further work. I think that there's a big conversation in kind of the academic world about academics, working too much or working too many hours. And so there's a huge backlash against that. And now it's all about, making sure you're not working too much and definitely going off email at certain times of day and definitely taking weekends off. And that actually doesn't necessarily work for everyone, but what you really want is the accommodation of variation and the ability for people to sort of choose their own way of doing things. But sometimes it feels like in certain workplaces, there's such a drive towards standardization.
Yeah.
I definitely don't agree with it.
So, and I'm then going to take us all the way back to something that we began with, where I can't remember their Christian names, but so Brown and Levinson and their kind of notion around face wants and positive face wants and negative face wants. So whilst I think in a way it's kind of quite reductionist and overly simplistic, if you think about some of the discussions and narrative that's happening around the workplace, which is find out what you're good at. So there's a phrase that often gets kind of touted around at conferences that I go to, which is find out what somebody's amazing at and then get out of their way. And and I'm like, well, that's that is in one sentence that's kind of summing up what Brown and Levinson were on about in terms of positive face wants being attend to what I'm good at and notice the good things about me, and negative face wants around I want to be unimpeded in what I do.
Right.
Then in that one non-academic sentence, it just kind of summarizes that those notions altogether. Whereas the standardization actually goes against both of those. It fights against both somebody's recognizing an individual for what they personally bring, but it also goes against giving them some freedom and autonomy to crack on with what they do. Okay, so one of the as part of my sort of prep for the podcast today, one of the things I wanted to explore is stance, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So could you define stance for me, if that's all right?
Stance is a sort of display towards a particular something. So it could be a display towards a person, towards a topic, towards a situation, towards sort of just things in the social situation. And it's a display of what we, interpreting an interaction, would take to be somebody's attitude or opinion or sort of general perspective. Okay.
And so how do people I say people, I don't know if that's right. How, in talk, how can stance be indicated?
Oh goodness, lots of ways. So paralinguistics, like you mentioned before, all the sort of like emphasis of words. So you can display a skeptical stance towards something by saying by emphasizing, did you do that? Right? It's sort of displays a little bit of a doubt. Or you can do it with particular words. So another way of displaying doubt would be to say, apparently, or, even without the tone of voice, apparently, blah, 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 or allegedly, right? That allows for some doubt. And, of course, there are also nonverbal things like your facial expression, raising eyebrows, again, just in the world of skepticism and doubt. And this would be true for any kind of display of any kind of stance.
And so is stance similar to framing in a way then? I
think that the way that you do stance can certainly accomplish a kind of framing. Yeah.
Okay.
Because framing is something that you kind of also do with others. So you can display a stance, and then if somebody displays a similar stance, then both of you can frame the conversation as, a doubt. Or if somebody can display a stance, the other person can display the opposite stance, and now you've displayed this or framed this conversation as a disagreement.
Right, okay.
Yeah,
okay. And I guess similar, so earlier on I asked, does emotion shape talk or does talk shape emotion? So I could use that similar approach to a question as saying, so I guess stance can shape the frame as well as the frame can shape the stance.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Once you have a frame that's fairly established, or if you come to a conversation that's, in a more institutional setting where the frame has kind of been given to that setting, then in a way it kind of helps you know what the appropriate stances might be, or what the available stances might be.
Yeah. So one of the an example of that I was thinking of was when I was in a meeting and the question was what work have you done so far? And I knew the person hadn't done any work so far. So we were there to talk about a particular project, and there were actions that individual had. And the question was, what work have you done so far? And the presupposition within that then is that work has been done.
Yes.
when actually there hadn't been.
Yeah.
And I was just sat there watching it thinking, I wonder where you're going to go with this one.
Yeah.
Because, to say you haven't done anything is going to be really tricky.
Yeah.
It's similar to, I guess while I'm making it, because I'm saying it, is similar to your cupcake example earlier on. The individual knows they should have done some work on it by now.
Yeah. Yeah.
They haven't. So do they lie or do they use strategic ambiguity? Do they give them do they imply that they've done some work so far?
Yeah. Yeah.
With things like, it's something that's been on my mind a lot recently.
Right.
It's been right at the forefront of my mind, and I haven't quite reached a conclusion about where I want to go with it yet. So that's a good question.
Yeah.
or do they go, you know what? I haven't done anything with that yet, because either way, if they get found out, and if the answer,
right.
if the lie is good enough,
mm-hmm.
then they might get away with it. But
mm-hmm.
if they get found in the lie, that's one thing. Whereas if they but then if they admit that they haven't done anything either, then that doesn't work.
Right? Yeah, it's a gamble.
Yeah. So I had an argument with my garage, they're not my garage anymore actually, because I've refused to use them. But I had an argument with the garage about some repairs that were necessary on my car.
Oh dear.
Because I was listening to them thinking, that's just a load of rubbish. And eventually, when I got to speak with the mechanic who had apparently assessed my car, and there's me framing apparently assessed, we got to the point of actually, no, the work didn't need to be done. My car would still pass its MOT if the work wasn't done.
Yeah.
But everything was positioned as such a this work must be done. Your car has to have the work done.
Right.
And my repeated questioning of, so will the car fail its MOT if I don't have the work done? Well, it's one of those things that it's really important that your car is safe and secure. And that's a lovely answer, and I agree with you. One of those things are important. My question was, and eventually got to the mechanic and said, no, it doesn't need to be done to pass the MOT. We would recommend it being done, but it doesn't have to be done. Okay, well, don't do it then. Just pass the MOT and give me your car back. Thanks very much.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. So I guess it's really complicated. Is where my head's at now.
Right.
Because I was going to ask, what advice could you give for people that are thinking about some of these aspects in the interactions that they have. But we've covered so many different things, and we've covered so much. I'm sat here going, oh, that's just really complicated.
Yeah. I mean, I think, in terms of just thinking through, reflecting on, before you say something, how is this going to be potentially taken by somebody else? And then when somebody says something to you, reflecting on how could they have meant this, especially in difficult conversations, I think that can be really helpful, because when you're in kind of just casual conversation, right, the back and forth flow doesn't allow for much reflection. There's usually things don't go very wrong, so you don't have to stop and reflect very much. But when you're having a difficult conversation, that's really the time when you have the space, and people expect you to take the space to be thoughtful about what you're saying. And I think it's very, very worthwhile to do that.
And I guess in work especially, there are lots of tricky conversations that can come up. Whether that, if somebody if somebody's offended you, somebody's not done something as well as you might like, or in a way different to what you thought it was going to be or you expected it to be. Yeah,
and there's a little bit of a push-pull between the thing you can tell the other person wants from you and your own kind of need to display yourself as a certain kind of person and not just give in. Sometimes, let's say you make a mistake, you encounter people in organizations who just want you to abase yourself with profuse apologies and so forth. And you, of course, may want to apologize because naturally you made a mistake, but maybe it's more important actually to move on and preserve the fact that a mistake is in the end just a mistake. And so you're not going to grovel. Well, that's a choice, right, that you have to make. So that person might be annoyed at you for not having properly groveled. And maybe that causes you problems down the line, but in the end you might decide, actually, I'm not going to waste any more time on this. I'm going to move forward and correct things. That's better for me.
So even though I was starting to wrap the podcast up, and I'm now thinking I want to open another door again.
Oh, yeah. Go for it.
So one of the So one of the things that is part of the context that in a way sort of shapes the interaction. So one of the things that I see, and one of the things that I've seen recently, is where an organization will use kind of the institutional power to affect interaction. So I'll be more specific. So the promise of further opportunity as a way of moderating kind of behavior and interaction, I find a fascinating dynamic. So the implication that at some point in the future something may happen, and then you modulate your interaction strategies off the back of that. So you things are happening that you don't agree with, or that kind of impinge you or interfere with what you want to do, or those sorts of things. Yet the promise of something in the future means that you don't say anything about those things. So you can see these things, maybe not like, they're not big atrocities that are happening, but just small aspects that are happening. And I had a conversation with somebody really recently where I said, well, at what point are you going to stand up for what you think? You're telling me this is how you think and how you feel about these things that are happening, yet you're not going to do anything because you don't want to rock the boat, because at some point in the future you might get this.
Right.
When you do get this, do you want to be the person who doesn't say anything because they don't want to rock the boat?
Yeah.
So you're not in a managerial position now. You potentially will be. And if you comply with not saying anything now, when you get into a managerial position, actually the pressure will be even more on you to comply.
Yes.
Because you're part of the establishment now.
Yeah.
So do you want to be a manager that, almost by not doing anything now, you're risking limiting yourself to doing anything in the future?
Yeah. Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah.
In what way? Go on, tell me what you think.
Well, just because, a common thing that people will say is, it's the people who are in higher positions or in positions of power who have the ability to change things, who have, they're sort of less held back by the fact that they're low status and their situation's more precarious, right? So really they're the ones who should be trying to sort of question stuff and challenge stuff. But actually what you're suggesting, and I think it's absolutely right, is that by the time you get to that point, you've bought into the system, and the system has sort of, I don't know, this is getting really like more Marxist than I meant it to, but but you know what I mean. It's sort of like when you are in something. I think it's the same for relationships. Once you've made a certain move and committed yourself in a certain way, then you've in a way ratified whatever the status quo was, because that's what you've kind of tacitly agreed to.
And if I get all Goffmanian with it, so once you've taken that line, that line forms part of your face.
Exactly.
It's there.
Yeah.
So the psychological and social pressure on you, and that you will put on yourself and others will put on you to conform with that line.
Yeah.
Is really strong. So,
it is. And it starts, I mean, of course, people make impressions as soon as they see you, but I think it jumps to a next level when you start speaking. As soon as you start talking, I speak, and you can hear that I'm speaking English with a particular accent, and automatically there's going to be things assumed about me. And if I started speaking with a high-rise intonation and ending everything as though it were a question at the end, then you would form perhaps some other interpretation of me that might have nothing to do with, say, what I believe about myself or the person I'm trying to come across as. But once that particular performance has been ratified by enough people, it's very hard to break out of it if you want to.
And that, so that I don't know what the right word is. I'm searching for the right word, which is why I'm pausing and hesitating. I'm buying myself time by just waffling away. The social dynamicness of face I find so fascinating, in that someone else can put a face on you. Exactly. For a long time I was, I am my own person. Thank you very much. I am who I am, and I decide who I am, and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And just by saying all that sort of stuff, at the end I now tell you that I don't think that anymore, because or don't you only think that anymore?
Uh-huh.
Because people will put me in a face. You know,
Yes.
they'll put faces on me, and I'm like, whoa, I don't want that face. I don't want that.
No.
I haven't subscribed to that or gone along with that.
Right.
And again, sometimes it's not overt. It can be a covert. You know, it can be a covert placing of face. Even today, so one of the things I talk about a lot is how I like to be quite evidence-based in what I do, which is why I do a lot of reading. I talk to researchers and like yourselves, and I like to base a lot of what I do on evidence. And there was a tweet that I read today with somebody talking about it was a recommendation that someone had taken an evidence-based approach to something, and I read their article, the source that they were quoting. And I was like, that's not a good critique in any way, shape or form. That's not an evidence-based approach. But an evidence-based approach should be like this. And I was like, oh, hang on a minute. How have I got to taking this, as a... because I've part of my face is about this, and then I've seen this that says it is, and that's not... I don't agree with that, so therefore it's a threat to that kind of aspect of my face. Oh,
exactly. Yeah.
And I... So part of me wonders, do I ever think it sometimes? Do I kind of think too much? Do I read too much into it?
I think that there's, for myself personally, it's much better to read too much into something than not to read enough into it. If you're going to go in the wrong direction, go in the wrong direction of too much thinking. Yeah, this is the thing that makes us, humans as opposed to a sunflower. Let's use it.
We use sunflowers. Sunflowers are good. Okay, so just to sort of, I said I was going to wrap the podcast up and then I opened another door. So let's come back to wrapping the podcast up. Right. So is there? Oh no. What the question I want to ask? So would it be possible for you to, or would you mind? There's some politeness rules in there. Putting together a list of some reading that you might suggest people to do. So that can be kind of books or articles, and if you've got any that you think are particularly interesting that you would like to share, then we can talk about that in a minute. But just from because one thing I do with each podcast is create what's called some show notes, and in the show notes there's sort of links to, if we talked about particular research or we talked about particular individuals, then we'll put links in. So we talked about Goffman and Brown and Levinson. So everyone that we've talked about I'll put in. Okay, so everything that we've talked about I'll put those in. But if you've got any extra that you think would be interesting for people, then if you ping them across to me on an email, then I can add them into the show notes as well.
Absolutely.
So there's a great book called Everyday Talk by Jessica Robles and Tracy. That's one book I'll play. Have you got any others that you'd recommend?
Off the top of my head, what I would recommend is just looking at Liz Stokoe's work. She's one of my colleagues, and she has various sort of books and articles, but she also has a website on a particular method that she uses, which she takes into organizations and helps them learn how to communicate better, and it's based on conversation analysis. So for people who are interested in sort of this perspective on talk and also how that could be applied, it's a great place to look at.
Okay, wonderful. And that's Elizabeth Stokoe, yes?
That's right, yeah.
And she's Leicester?
No, she's at Loughborough.
Loughborough, okay. Okay. I will find her website then, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes as well.
Yeah.
Is there anything else then? Anything else that you're on kind of emotion, talk, interaction? Anything else that you're thinking, feeling, would like to say?
It's an area that I'd like to do more research on, so I'm actually working on potentially putting together a book proposal on emotion as an action-oriented resource, and so we'll see where that goes, and I will definitely let you know how it's wrapping up.
Wow! So say that again. Emotion as an action-oriented resource.
Exactly. Yeah. So this is something some people and I put together a panel at a recent conference, and we got a lot of interesting things out of it, including some of the stuff I talked about on children kind of leaving space for interjections during their crying. And so we're going to see if we can turn this into a book.
Wow. Was that the conference in Belfast?
That's right, yeah.
Oh, I so wish I could have gone to that.
Yeah, it was fun.
Yeah, I was both enjoying and being jealous of the interactions that were happening on Twitter. I was like, I want to be there, but this is really great, but I want to be there.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Wonderful. Thank you.
Yep.
Just as a quick aside, and I'm not going to open another door. Have you heard of a lady called Nancy Klein?
That sounds vaguely familiar, but I can't say.
So, so she's written a couple of books. One called Time to Think, and another one called More Time to Think. But she plays with conversation. So she talks about creating what's called a thinking environment, and there are 10 principles of a thinking environment. But one of the things that she kind of focuses on is getting people to think and speak individually. So, and not like all the time, but what she talks about in terms of being able to create environments where people can truly think is to give them freedom and space to think on their own. So one of the strategies, so there's a number that she uses, but one of those is called a thinking pair. And the idea being that people, you have two roles, you have a thinker and a thinking partner, and you have a question that you want to answer. And then the role of the thinking partner is to help the thinker think. So they make no audible, they make no contribution to the thinking. So they are there to listen, pay attention, make appropriate noises, encouragers, head nods.
Right,
So they use communicative devices, but not to interject or to add anything.
Or at least not explicitly.
Well, not explicitly, no. And that, see, now I wasn't going to open a door. I was just going to tell you about it because I thought you might.
That sounds interesting and impossible.
Well, so I think you might find her work interesting.
Yeah. That does sound very interesting.
As a contrast, because what she tries to do is to break down those bits of communication.
Right.
Now I'm with you in that the in terms of the place that people make noises, the noises that they make, will still signal something because you cannot not communicate, if that's
exactly.
But I just thought you might be interested in her work.
I can imagine that'd be an interesting kind of exercise to see what happens. Yeah.
Okay, all right. Well, anyway, let's wrap it up. So thank you so much, Jessica, for your time today.
Thank you.
It's been wonderful to have you on the podcast. If you don't mind sending those links to kind of any books or articles that you recommend people have a look at, then I'll add them to the show notes. But other than that, Dr. Jessica Robles, thank you so much for your time today. It's been really, really great to chat with you, and I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Written, recorded and presented by Phil Wilcox, edited together by Simon Levinson. You can find more information at emotionatwork.co.uk or follow us on Twitter at Phil Wilcox. Thanks for listening.
Hello again, fair podcast listener, and you've made it all the way to the end of the podcast. So I've got a challenge for you. Within that podcast, you heard Jessica and I talk about things like how people leave gaps for speech, how some of those rituals are there in conversation, how how people share the floor, the way we share the conversation between us. So go back and pick a 10-minute section of our conversation and listen out for them. Go listen out for the way that I leave space, or the way that Jessica leaves space, the way we support and encourage each other to speak. So I thought it might be fun to do a little challenge. Go back and listen, see if you can hear the way that Jessica and I kind of manage the interaction between us, because it's not done on a deliberate level, but yet we managed to do it anyway. Okay, thanks for listening.